Hello, welcome to my presentation for the 2024 Interactive Film and Media Annual Virtual Conference on Communities, Structures, and Entanglements. My name is Emily Collins, and I'm a PhD candidate in Cinema and Media Studies at York University. My paper is titled Sounding a Clearing, Social and Collective Listening Otherwise. Artist and musician Jerome Ellis's notion of the clearing refers to the silent and unpredictable gaps in his speech, made from a glottal block stutter. When speaking with someone, Ellis characterizes these long pauses as relational affordances rather than discomforts or debilitation, where he and others can enter this sort of singular, unanticipated, and indeterminate temporal space together. The present moment becomes transformed and opened up, but when Ellis's listener interrupts, the temporal and otherworldly reconfiguring is foreclosed. The clearing can be read as a form of otherwise sonic social relations that diverge from normative social expectations and temporal logics. These relations enable possibilities for reframing epistemological fields and ontological understandings of communication, time, listening, and relations, because, as Ellis explains, through the clearing we can gather in the present in a new way. This paper concerns something similar. The ways that we are invited into alternative and divergent sonic social relations in ways that are unexpected and incalculable, yet intimate, immersive, and generative. What will be argued throughout is that the productive capacities found in these otherwise sonic social relations generated by the exhibition, Another World That Sounds Like You, are one example of the many ways to produce listening practices that problematize and implicate a politics of sound that hinge on divergent forms of attention and engagement. Curated by Tolene Took, Another World That Sounds Like You, presented at Gallery TPW in Toronto, features sound-based works ranging from sound essays, musical pieces, recordings, and soundscapes by artists Bani Abidi, Nick Dorado, Jerome Ellis, Yurok Shuran, and Hong Kai Wang. The show centers the relationship of sound to different social, political, and cultural events around the world, primarily vocalized or performed by marginalized communities in protest and resistance. Designed to resemble a living room with several rugs and low comfortable seating, the exhibition space nurtures deep, slow, and participatory forms of engagement and attention, as the soundworks are presented on several speakers over a period of 2.5 hours on loop. This setup calls on visitors to listen carefully to difference and that which they may not fully comprehend, yielding and relying on an immersive and durational encounter, and thus entangling the formal, affective, and aesthetic dimensions. This particular type of call, to listen slowly, carefully, and attentively, is especially crucial to the aims of the discourses and histories that these women artists and artists of color seek to reveal. Following Ashton T. Crawley, I use the term otherwise rather than new to underscore the ways these radical strategies, modes, and ways of life already exist but are repressed under Western, heteronormative, and able-bodied paradigms. The otherwise, as a critique of the given and the normative, is an enactment of irreducible openness, signifying possibility and capacity. I extend the work of Paulina Oliveros and Jean-Luc Nancy to understand listening as a mode of attention and attunement, comparably engendering possibility and openness that relays between public and private, internal and external, self and other. But this is not to discount the harms that listening can likewise produce. At times, more than merely a means of observation, listening can become a method of appropriation and extraction through the role of recording technologies in creative endeavors, in producing and perpetuating colonial ideologies, and invasive tendencies. Nonetheless, listening can equally be mobilized for usurping and resisting these structures. As evidenced in the recent calls to remap and decolonize the field through alternative approaches to listening, such as fugitive listening, border listening, critical listening positionality, and abolitionary listening, it is imperative, I think, to consider the ways in which listening heals as well as harms, attunes as well as captures, gathers as well as separates, thereby inciting critical and creative inquiry. The listening practices and effective socio-material relations that the exhibition stages are established through a confluence of mechanisms. The material affordances and implications embedded within the installation design, and the selection of an international range of artworks that both draw on and speak to the role of sound in different global, cultural, and political movements. When taken together, these components enlist the visitor in a web of relations that are equal parts complex, meditative, and shared. By critically engaging with the various approaches, sets of relations, and effective encounters generated by the exhibition, we can better understand how listening in moments of otherwise sonic social relations can call on the spectator to engage otherwise. That is, to encounter and care for historical and political depths that may not be fully comprehensible, akin to what Édouard Glissant calls the right to opacity, a form of honoring and preserving the complex and untranslatable aspects of difference. In examining these works, the methodology of listening otherwise, constituting otherwise sonic social relations, emerges not just as a hermeneutic practice, but also as an ethics of relation. Another world that sounds like you is more than just an invitation to relax or passively consume. Yet the intimacy and pleasure that it derives through its relational capacity cannot be entirely dismissed, because as Brandon LaBelle states, to produce and receive sound is to be involved in connections that make privacy intensely public and public experience distinctly personal. When scholars turn their attention to listening as a theoretical and methodological force, the question of space, public and private, as a qualifier and propagator of auditory waves and vibrations is often given particular focus. To emphasize this entanglement between the inherently spatial and thus public nature of sound with the very intimate experience of listening, Mark Patterson writes, "Sounds are as close to us as our thoughts." Beyond questions of proximity, private, and public space, Laurent Berlant's notion of intimacy, theorized as a mode of relation invoked through listening, is a way of world-making outside of normative terms of management and organization. For example, among friends, strangers, or community. In the visceral scenes and events that cultivate what Berlant calls intimate publics, audition is not necessary, but performing audition, listening and attuning, produces attachments to and investments in a sense of political and social mutuality that is performed in moments of collective audition. Through intimate publics, Berlant ruptures and repurposes intimacy, often privatized or formalized in heteronormative contexts, towards all relations, sorts of attachments, and spaces of enjoyment that contribute to one's flourishing. At Gallery TPW, intimacy is configured similarly, through otherwise listening to these collective soundings and voicings, in a way that does not rely on a priori categories or understandings, but both frames and emanates from relations, or in other words, it is produced and productive in collective social situations. Through the manipulation of space, in the best sense of the word, or rather the spatial and temporal reconfiguring of the gallery, the artworks activate multisensory and embodied modes of perception, rather than exclusively visual or auditory means, mobilizing different registers of intimacy and engagement simultaneously. Before even entering the main space, the conspicuous exhibition design calls visitors to engage with this aesthetic environment differently, more intimately, by taking off their shoes and bringing a cup of tea with them into the space. The act of taking off one's shoes is both a gesture and a ritual. As if we shed a layer of ourselves, it is disarming, prompting vulnerability and tenderness. It is a ritual that is deeply familiar and ubiquitous, yet a profound gesture that can shape the ways we enter and subsequently participate in the space, including how we might listen in that space, especially if it is not ours. While other types of communal activities might have similar requisites, in an art historical and institutional context, this invitation and act provokes questions around spectatorship, participation, and community, and how they can be formed and refashioned in ways that are informal and intimate, welcoming, healing, and contemplation while countering typical Western social etiquette. Rather than extensive wall didactics explaining each artwork, oral didactics fill the space in between sound works, announcing and contextualizing the next track. Visitors are acknowledged not only in the instructions on what to wear, drink, and how to sit, but through these oral didactics as well. Their vocality, notably recorded using a female voice, functions as a technology of relation that takes hold of the visitor, activating their attention while negotiating between the disjuncture between body and voice, sound and source. The oral didactics aid in the construction of the show's particular forms of intimacy and complexity by providing more personal and extensive program notes, and as a technology of relation, engaging the visitor in an assemblage, a connective pull and process of attunement and attentiveness with the work. As part of this research, I was fortunate to speak with Hong Kai Wang and Jerome Ellis about their practice broadly and these works in particular, allowing a closer investigation with their two projects. In Haze, Wang led an open rehearsal with young Palestinian and Jordanian women, where she recorded them singing an oral Palestinian lament called 𝗎𝗏, along the geological fault lines at the Jordanian-Palestinian border, signaling the complex and multi-layered depths of conflict and loss. This ritual has long been banned and poorly documented, so the singers had to think back to their relatives' ways of doing 𝗎𝗏, exemplifying what Diana Taylor calls the repertoire, challenging the official archive by referring to the lived practices and embodied performances that act as vital means of storing and transmitting knowledge and memory. Jerome Ellis's work activates an African-American spiritual and signal song, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, which played a significant role in protecting and communicating messages about the Underground Railroad concerning organization, planning, rebellion, and escape. In an interview with me, Ellis explains that songs like this were used to communicate safely by encoding messages from those who the organizers did not want to hear what they were planning. In Ellis's version, the tempo is slowed and elongated, a recurring approach he uses in musical pieces to represent his own social experiences and interactions involving speech that is at odds with standardized rhythms and pacing. In these two works, sound and listening are brought forward and explored as sites of resistance, but also much more than that, as forms of access, code, protection, and opacity. These songs act as catalysts for a kind of gathering, and although historically located, where they have incited specific relational forms and communal activity, 𝗎𝗏 as collective mourning, expressions sustained by intergenerational and embodied transmission, and African-American signal songs that facilitate safe movement and escape, in their recent creative reactivation and presentation, they continue to catalyze gathering. Ellis says, they bring people together in churches, they bring people together in this gallery, they bring people together in the woods, And the sound is this kind of, the sound and the song is this kind of technology within which we can gather and that calls us to gather. On top of the profoundly collective and collaborative nature of 𝗏𝗄 and swing low, sweet chariot, the sounds of each form radical knowledges outside of official discourses that challenge and circumvent restrictions on certain forms of cultural activity, such as mourning, and movement, such as through secret routes and safe houses. Despite being minor texts and informal histories, by both shaping and rearranging understandings and relations to time, history, knowledge, and memory, these works build worlds with the intimate intangibility and relationality of listening. They vividly evoke the past, but recontextualize these histories through embodied forms of speculation, grounded in present and future imaginings. At Gallery TPW, we are tasked to listen closely, despite the possibility that we might not comprehend what is being said or without context, if, for example, we arrive after the didactic announcement. Thus, we listen to the unknown, to difference, without reducing it to a transparent or coherent singular phenomenon. Instead, in this contemplative and inquisitive space, we stay with its opacity and fugitivity, which, according to Glissant, is a world-making project, not of disillusion or disregard, but a refusal of the Eurocentric demand that experience and subjectivity be made transparent. Fred Moten's notion of fugitivity is particularly instructive here, as well as it delineates a category of the irregular that evades easy representations and is both a desire and spirit of escape and transgression. Voices that do not conform to the ideal liberal subject, that are in excess, surplus, and outside, and that refuse to be defined, categorized, and made legible, fall within this designation. Black voices, women's voices, queer voices, trans voices. When we encounter these excesses as sounds of flight and refusal, a process of attunement or listening otherwise is required, in which we stay with the complexities and differences without trying to contain or illuminate them. In the resonant space of listening otherwise, there is both vulnerability and pleasure, which makes possible a solidarity that acknowledges the irreducible differences that coalesce around the shared desire to make the world otherwise. In the exhibition, fugitivity emerges in multiple contexts and configurations. In the fugitive sounds embedded in and emanating from the artworks, in the space of fugitivity and opacity cultivated in the design where one might recede, and as a modality of attunement with these effective material relations. The call to listen to what is illegible or unintelligible is crucial to the politics and ethics of women and artists of color who take up institutional space in a way that artist Carolyn Lazard describes as being in but not of the institution, to alter power relations and sensory dynamics in spectatorship, art criticism, and curatorial practice. Beyond working closely and poignantly with the potentials of sound to unveil deeper and intersecting realms of resistance, by calling us to listen otherwise, another world that sounds like you underscores and entangles attunement, sociality, and relationality, activating alternative forms of individual subjectivity and collective belonging. Thank you.